All right. So I'm going to be using Lightroom today, which is typically what I use for my images. This is the program that I use when I catalog my own photos. So that's typically what I like to use. Now, when you're working with a program like Perfect Effects, it's a stylizing program. This is something that you're going to be using to add effects to your images. And most of the time, you can do some basic edits inside Lightroom before you go into Perfect Effects. However, Perfect Effects has just about everything that you need to do any of those basic edits. So it really is just depending on what program you like to use and where you want to do that information. So I always like to mention that because some people like to start out editing in their own personal program like Lightroom, Photoshop, Aperture, whatever you may use. You can go ahead and use those programs to do your basic edits, and then you can jump into Perfect Effects from there. A lot of times Perfect Effects is kind of an ending program. So that's where people go when they're going to finish their images off and then get them ready for, let's say you're going to place them up on Facebook, or you're going to place them up on Flickr, or whatever you might be using. So here inside Lightroom, we've got a catalog of images, and we're going to start out, and I'm going to edit a portrait. And this is something that a lot of people edit portraits, a lot of people take portraits. It depends on what you do, whether you're in the business of taking portraits, whether you just do it for fun. But editing photos of people is very different than editing photos of buildings and oceans and big landscapes and inanimate objects. And you have to think about the fact that you're editing images of people who have a skin tone. And if you alter the skin tone too much, things start to look a little weird. So this editing process is going to be a little bit different. Now, before we go into Perfect Effects, I can take this over to my develop module here inside of Lightroom, and I can do some edits if I want to. This image is pretty good straight out of camera, so there isn't much I want to worry about here. If you're working with portraits, it's also very good to mention this. I think I forgot to last time, so I always like to make sure I mention this. If you're going to be doing any kind of portrait editing that's a little bit more advanced, you always want to go into Perfect Portrait before you go into Perfect Effects. You never want to edit a portrait after you've added effects. That changes the quality of the image, and you want to edit it before you place on, let's say you want to add a warming filter, which is what we're going to do with this image, or maybe some sort of cool vintage effect, or even a texture. All of those things are going to be changed if you edit your portrait, like skin smoothing, blemish removal, all those different things. They'll change, and they'll be upset by editing a portrait afterwards. So if I needed to edit this image in Perfect Portrait, I would do that first before I go into Perfect Effects. So just a quick note about editing portraits there. All right, so if there was anything I needed to do in the develop module, I could do that here. And once I'm ready to edit, all I'm going to do is right-click my image, go to Edit In, and go to Perfect Effects. And it doesn't matter what program you use. So if you're a Photoshop user, if you're a Lightroom user like I am, if you're an Aperture user, we get people who use all different types of products. So it just depends on your workflow. So we're going to edit a copy with my Lightroom adjustments. And if you're going through Lightroom, that's one of the most important things. You always want to edit a copy of your image with those Lightroom adjustments so that you've got those attached to your image. Now, here inside the photo suite, we're in Perfect Effects. And on the left-hand side, you have your effects library. This is where you're going to find all the different categories that you have access to. In the middle, you've got your preview. And then on the right-hand side, you've got your effects stack. And this is where you're going to stack multiple effects together to create those presets I had mentioned earlier. So let's go ahead. Let's start on the left-hand side, and let's do some basic effects just so I can show you guys kind of what's in here first. So let's scroll down, and the category that I always automatically jump to for portraits is the vintage category. It's a popular styling nowadays, particularly for things like engagement portraits like this one, or wedding portraits or family portraits. People always want to add some sort of kind of like cool or warm, cross-processy vintage styling to it, and you'll see it everywhere. And the vintage category is a really great place to start with this. Now, I'll open up my category, and you can see that you've got all these nice high-res previews, so you can actually see what the effects are going to look like on your image. Another thing that you have access to with 7.5, so make sure you've got your software updated. If you have Suite 7, you should have updated to 7.5. It was a free update that came for all users, and that included our Quick View browser. And I really like the Quick View browser. It's very helpful. It's the icon to the right-hand side of each category. And you'll see it's got kind of a grid and then a little play button right there. So if you click on that, it opens up the full screen browser view of all of the different presets that are inside a certain category. You can view just about any category, all categories like this. And this can be a good way to scroll through previews a lot quicker. And this is something that I think a lot of people who've had Suite 7 don't really do because they just got Suite 7.5 and they haven't gotten used to this new feature, but it's one of my favorites. So I definitely suggest using this when you're doing a lot of heavy editing because you can just see your images a lot better. Now, let me scroll through and I'll show you guys some of these different previews here that you can take a look at. Any of the ones that have a flag next to it mean that I flagged these presets as favorites. And this is also something that I like to suggest. There are a lot of people who don't use favorites, and I always recommend it. When I work with my personal images, ones that, may not necessarily go up on a professional website or, I'm shooting for someone else. If I'm working on images of my own, I always save favorites. I have tons of presets and I use a lot of favorites because I don't really care about a lot of these presets. Like I'm never going to use the whole get infrared filter. So why do I want to look at it? So saving things as favorites can really help streamline getting in and out a lot quicker. And I recommend that's kind of one of those tips that get you in and out faster. And you can save things so that you don't have to look at the ones you know you're never going to use. So let's scroll through and we'll see we've got a whole bunch of options here. Now I am going to scroll down and I am going to start out with this one called Vintage Warm. Now, when you're in the Quick View browser to apply a preset, all you need to do is click on it once and it'll add it to your image. That's it. Now, the first thing I need to do is it added kind of a funky tone to the skin. And I like this preset, but I want to tone it down just a little bit. It's too intense. So on the right-hand side in the effects stack, there's something called the amount slider. And this is basically an opacity slider. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, you're going to recognize that term. And all it does is it reduces the amount the effect is being applied to your image. So if I take this slider and let's move it down to the left, I go all the way back to 0, and this is my original image. When I pump it up to 100, that's 100% this effect on my photo. So always remember that you have access to this amount slider. People will add an effect and they'll be like, well, it's way too strong, I don't like to use it. Well, try playing around with that amount slider because it lessens it just a little bit. So let me take that down just a bit and it'll reduce that effect just enough on the skin so it's not quite so red. Now, you'll notice down at the bottom of my vintage category, that vintage warm preset that I just applied, effect that I just applied, it hasn't been saved as a favorite yet. So to save something as a favorite, all you do is click inside the flag on the bottom right-hand corner of that effect. And now that the flag is filled in, it gets placed in my favorites category, which I'm going to pop over to right now. And these are all of my favorites that I have saved on this computer. And these are the ones, again, that I like to use on a regular basis. So over in the effects stack, the next thing that we want to do is we want to add another effect on top of this one. So I want to click the Add button inside my effects stack. And now I've got a brand new empty layer. On the left-hand side, all of the different presets over here, all of their previews have updated so you can see what the previews look like on top of the vintage warm effect that you just applied. So these previews on the left-hand side are smart updating. And that's something that I feel like people don't take advantage of enough because it's a really great feature inside the suite. So you don't have to wonder about how two different effects are going to look together. It'll automatically update that for you so you can take a look at it. So that's really helpful here. Now, these are all of my different favorite presets, and I can scroll through and see if there's one in here that I might want to apply. But if not, I'll just go back to my effects library and we'll scroll through and we'll find something else. Now, there are tons of other categories here that we can play around with. And I want to point out when you're working on portraits that there are two other specific categories just for portraits. And one of them is actually a portrait retouch category. And this is for very, very baseline retouching. So if you don't want to go into perfect portrait, if it's not your program, or you just don't want to spend the time in there, you can always do very, very basic edits here. So we've got a magic eye fixer, which goes in and brightens and whitens the whites of the eyes, and then it adds a little bit of contrast to the irises, so that can help pop out the eyes. We've got a reduce shine brush here that helps reduce shine on the face. We have a way for you to kind of tan skin if they got a little bright underneath a flash maybe. We also have a whitener brush, so you can actually go in and brush whiteness back into someone's teeth. So that can be helpful depending on what you're doing. So very, very basic edits here underneath the portrait retouch category. And then right up above is the portrait enhance category. And this is one, again, that I don't think it's used very often, but there are some really cool effects in here that should definitely be used. And a lot of them are ways to brighten up your portraits, add a little bit more contrast to your portraits, but also make sure that you don't go in and add a little too much detail. One of the things that always goes wrong, especially I've noticed with landscape, a lot of landscape photographers who then swap over into portraits, one of the things that happens is a lot of times people continue to add things like tonal contrast and excessive amounts of clarity to portraits. And unless that's the style that you're going for, you lose a lot of the softness of a skin, and you really enhance all of the imperfections and a lot of the creases in the skin and the clothes, and they start to look a little freaky. People start to look a little freaky when you add too much tonal contrast. So what a lot of these portrait enhance presets do is they help soften the image a little bit so the skin looks really nice. It kind of adds a very soft glow, and they can be very helpful. So one of my favorites is something called Graham Cracker, which I'll go ahead and click on to apply. And all it does is it brightens up the whole image. It adds some intense contrast, and then you'll see it adds a very soft kind of surface blur to the photo. So it loses a little bit of the crispness, but it's a very soft effect. Now, once again, inside the effects stack, I can take my amount slider and just move that over to the left to reduce that effect a little bit. So I don't want to be at 100% here. I probably want to be at about 70. And then I'm going to click on the add button one more time, and we're going to add another effect on top of it. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add some sort of vignette. Now, a quick note about the effects libraries, there's also a search bar up at the top of your screen, and you can go in and you can actually search for effects that you might be looking for. So let's say I'm looking for a vignette and I don't necessarily know where to find it. Now, for future reference, there are vignette categories down here at the bottom. So there are whole categories specific to vignettes, but just in case you don't know where to find something, all you need to do is type in a word inside that search bar up at the top of the screen. So it's kind of like a hot word. Like if I know I'm looking for a warm preset, I'll just type in the word warm, and all of the search results will relate to the word warm. If I'm looking for a vignette, I can just type in the word vignette, and it'll show me all of the results that relate to the word vignette. So this can be a good way to kind of quickly find something that you may not know where it is. So let's go ahead and scroll through. We've got things like subtle vignette here. We've got a lightning vignette. We've got Big Softy, which is the one that I'm going to end up using. So I'll go ahead and click on that to apply it. It's a very subtle vignette, not much to it. Again, I can play around with the effect stack. If it's a little too strong, I can reduce that effect a little bit. And there we go. Now, once I've combined all three of these different layers, we added a vintage layer, we added that graham cracker layer, which is kind of a contrast and a little bit of a surface blur to soften the image, and then we added a vignette. Once we've done all three of these, let's say I have a whole bunch of images from the same photo shoot, and I want to add the exact same filters to each one of those images. I want to save this as a preset so that I can reuse it later. And presets are one of the best things to use inside Perfect Effects. So to do that, I'm going to go up to the preset menu and choose Save Preset. We'll call this Vintage Warm Soft Vignette Preset. I don't always go very creative on the names of my presets, and the reason why I recommend that you don't go crazy on the names of your presets is sometimes when you're looking for presets, you can't remember exactly what it is. So I'm very boring with my preset names, so Vintage Warm, Soft Vignette, that works for me. Some people like to give them cool names, like, I can't even think of one right now. So anyways, just be smart with your preset name, because if you search inside your presets library for a preset, which you can do, if you didn't give it a good name, then you're not going to be able to find it. Now, underneath is the category drop-down menu, and you can place your preset into a category. You'll see I have portrait presets and vintage film presets here that I like to use on a regular basis. So I can pop this in my portrait presets category. I can type in a creator, and I can type in a description as well. Descriptions are a good way to just remember what the preset is and why you created it. If you're going to be sharing presets with friends, which I do, you can swap presets back and forth, kind of like On1 Effects playing cards. You can actually type in a description so people know what they're getting too. So that's fun. So let's go ahead and click Create. And I'm going over to my presets library here on the top left-hand side of my screen. And I'm going to show you how presets work. So this is what my image looked like after we went through and did all of those changes. I'm going to go through and we're going to start from scratch. This is my original image. And let's go ahead, let's add a preset so I can, there's some idiosyncrasies with working with presets. So we'll open up Portrait Presets category. You'll see I've got a whole bunch in here that I can use. And I want to use the exact same one called Vintage Warm Soft Vignette Preset. So I'll click on it to apply, and it'll add it to my image. It looks exactly the same as where we started, which is great. The reason why it is because it saves the order of the effects that we added and all of the blending changes. So those opacity sliders that we edited saves all of those changes for me. Now, on the right-hand side in the effects stack, it appears as though it's only applied this preset in one layer. And if I wanted to, I could apply this and I could send it back to Lightroom and be good to go. But let's say we want to go in and we want to delete that graham cracker layer. I don't like the way it looks on a certain image. All I need to do is in the effects stack, if you click on the expand button, it expands your preset out into all of the different layers that were used to create that preset. So now if I want to, I can go to my graham cracker layer. I'll just select it. I'm going to click the delete button, and then I'll go back to my empty layer on top. And now I still have my nice vignette. I've got that vintage warm layer, but I reduced that graham cracker down because I didn't necessarily like that softness on the image anymore. And if I want to, I can add another effect on top of it. If I needed to lighten an image or darken an image, I could do that here. So every photo is different. And sometimes the preset is going to work straight out of the box just great. And then other times you're going to need to go in and edit a couple things to make it work for you. So always remember that you have both of those options there. You can click apply and get out as soon as possible, or you can go in and you can edit each layer separately. So let's go ahead and let's cancel out of this image. Let's talk about a couple of other things inside effects. And we're going to delve a little bit deeper this time around. So we're going to edit another portrait, and then we're going to jump into a landscape. So don't worry, we're going to be hitting landscapes eventually, I promise. I promise. So we've got an image here. I'm going to add some sort of sun glow to it. If I need to make any develop changes here inside Lightroom, I could do that if I need to. I don't need to for this image. So let's control click, go to edit in, and perfect effects. Now, really quickly about the copy file options, if you guys are Lightroom users, there is a copy file options dialog box that pops up, and you can change how you want your file format to be. So this image is originally a RAW file. So a lot of the images, most people use RAW files most of the time. And RAW files are great. You have access to your originals all the time. You have the ability to always go back to that original photo no matter how many changes you've made to it. RAW files are amazing, and they're huge. You can print them huge. They're great. When you're editing in Perfect Effects, you can't edit just a straight RAW file. It's going to need to swap over into another format. And I typically use something called PSD files, which allow you to have access to layers. They have a huge format. They're non-destructive, so that's something that I use. I like to keep my color space at a medium range. So I know that I'm going to be printing most of my images because I edit for print typically. So I make sure that my color space reflects that, as does my bit depth and my resolution. So always know that you have these options here inside of Lightroom before you go into Perfect Effects, and this can really help the output of your image at the end. So if you're just an editor for the web, you can change a couple of these settings. If you're an editor for print, you can change these settings as well. So always know you have that option inside Lightroom. So let's open up inside Perfect Effects. I'm going to show you guys a couple other things that you can do. So we'll go over to the effects library, and one of the categories that I always like to show off is something called sunshine. And the sunshine category is, we'll open it up, and you've got a couple different options here. Now, the reason why the sunshine category is so great is it allows you to add kind of a sun glow effect that's very popular with portraits nowadays. And one of my favorites is something called warm highlights. And all it does is it warms up the highlights in an image. We also up above have something called radiance, which I really like. It's an intensifying filter. It has kind of a soft effect to it. It adds a little bit of contrast to the image. It pumps up the yellows and the oranges and the reds in a photo. And then last but not least is something called the golden hour enhancer. And this is something that works great on landscapes and portraits alike. And it goes in, and I'll just click on it so you guys can actually see it. It's a little intense when you add it just straight out of the box, but it adds this really soft, warm tone to your entire image. And I really, really love this effect. I use it on all different types of images all the time. You'll see it's saved as a favorite because I use it repeatedly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this golden hour enhancer on my image. I might lower the amount of the effect just a little bit because it is kind of strong. She's starting to look a little too tan, which we don't want to, lie about how tan she is. Now we've gone in and we've warmed up the photo quite a bit. The next thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of coolness to the shadows in the image. So to do that, I'm going to show you kind of a fun way to do that that's a little different. Let me click on the Add button here. We've got an empty layer, and I'm going to go up to a category that I don't think a lot of people use. It's called the Antique category. And when I open it up, you get these things called antique flats. And antique flats are duotone prints, and it was something that you actually still can do in the darkroom. It's a really cool effect. It's basically a solid color for the shadows. There's a little bit of speckling of gray and then bright, completely white or blue or yellow. You choose two different colors and they're your highlights and your shadows. There's a little bit of gray in between, but for the most part, it's a very posterized look. So I'm going to click on the Antique Flat Indigo, and it does a completely 180 on the image. It's totally different, but we're actually going to go in and change this effect. So I've shown you how to add effects just baseline on your image. However, when we add something that may need a little bit of tweaking, there is a button inside your effects stack called the Options button. When I click that open, it pops up this blending options dialog box. And these are all of the advanced blending options you have access to inside effects. And you should definitely take use of these because they're very, very important. The first thing right up at the top is something called the blending mode. If you're a Photoshop user, you're going to recognize what blending modes are. If you're not, it is a way for you to blend effects into your image in a unique way. So right now, this effect is just flat on your image. It's not blending in or anything. It's just doing its thing. It's a duotone layer of blue and white. It's very, very flat. I want to go in and I want to change how it's blending with my image. So up at the top, you've got an area which is the darken section, and it goes in and it takes it and it blends it in and it darkens the image. You have the lighten section, which is it blends it in and it lightens your image. You have the overlay section, which blends the effect into your photo and tries to add a little bit of contrast and color to certain parts of your image. These two, overlay and soft light, are very typical to be used when blending an effect into your image. Down at the bottom, you have these two weird ones called difference and exclusion, which no one almost ever uses. And then you also have a couple down here that are hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. I'm going to use the color one. So just by selecting a completely different blend mode, we went from the original image, which is completely flat, you can't see any of the color coming through, and then the color option. It blends that color into your image, and now I've pulled back a lot of that detail from my original photo. So that's our first step. The next step is to go down and choose which part of the image I want this effect to be applied to. And you have two different options here. The first being Apply Effect to drop-down menu. So if I want to, I could only apply this blue filter to the midtones in my image, or the highlights in my image, or the shadows in my image. I can go down and apply it to things like vivid colors or flesh colors or neutrals. There are a lot of neutrals in this image or close to neutrals. You can choose a specific color channel. If I only want to apply this to the yellows in the image, you'll see it's going to blue down a lot of those yellows in the back. Now I'm going to choose shadows. I'll go ahead and choose that shadows box. Now, the fuzziness slider, if I take this over and I move it to the left, come on, move to the left, you'll see that it's intensifying that color and it's intensifying where it's being applied. If I move this over to the right, it's going to soften the edges of where this color is being applied to. Play around with this fuzziness slider. It just depends on the image that you're using. I like to move it over to the right to kind of lessen the effect a little bit. Now, underneath is the protect section, and the protect section allows you to protect certain tones in your image. So I have this effect only applied to the shadows. So me moving this remove effect from highlights filter is not going to do anything. It hasn't applied the effect to the highlights, so I don't have to worry about that. I don't want to protect my shadows because I'm applying the effect to my shadows, but you have these two options here. The only other one that's worth mentioning is the flesh colors slider, and this can help remove an effect from fleshy colors in your image. So if I take this slider and move it over to the right, it's just going to reduce the effect on her skin tone here and a couple of the yellows in the background. So I can use this to save some of those warmer tones in my image. And you'll see it went from being blue all the way up her arm, and now it's a much softer effect there. So let me take that flesh colors and we'll move it over just a little bit more. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is just take my amount slider, which this is the exact same amount slider that you have inside your effects stack. They're exactly the same slider. This one is just inside the blending options dialog box to make it easier to get in and out and do all of your blending changes here. So I'm just going to take that amount slider and I'm going to move it over to the left. And once I'm happy, I'll click the apply button. And now I've applied these changes to my image. So we started out with, on the left-hand side, you'll see our original effect. It's the Antique Flat Indigo layer. It's completely duotone. There's not much to this effect. This is what it looks like after we took it through the blending options dialog box. These blending options that you have access to inside Perfect Effects are some of the best things that you can use inside the program. They really, really are. I always try and stress that when I do these advanced Perfect Effects webinars, because I feel like people don't use them as much, and they could do amazing things to your images. Now we have kind of a vintagey look. We have warmer highlights. We have cooler shadows, all without having to go into the vintage category and find one that maybe some of those vintage effects are not my favorite and I don't necessarily like the way they look. This is a way for me to tweak the effects and make them my own. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is click on the Add button, and I want to talk to you about something on the right-hand side called Effect Options, and you might have seen it pop up a couple of times. Now, I'm going to close the Effects library on the left-hand side, and to do that, you just click in between the Effects library and the preview. So you can just click once, and it'll hide that library for me. And this is a good way to do a full screen view so you can actually see your whole image on your screen. You can also hide the other side if you want to, but most of the time you're doing editing on the right-hand side, so you want to hide the left-hand side. That's typically how I work. You also have the option of pressing the Tab key, and the Tab key will remove all of the panels on the left and the right-hand side, and then you'll have that nice full screen view. And when you click it again, it'll bring you back to your previous state. So you've got that Tab key there as well. Now, on the right-hand side, let's go back to Effect Options. This is something that's very, very important. This is where most of these presets on the left-hand side are built. Let me open up this drop-down menu so I can show you. We've got all these different categories, and these are very baseline categories here. So we have a black and white producer, we have a blur producer, we have borders, We've got vignette down at the bottom. You can build your own vignette. We've got tone enhancer, which is going to be the one that we're going to use. Sharpening, photo filter. So we have all of these different options, and a lot of the presets on the left-hand side are built from special formulas inside these different effect options. So let's start with the basic one called tone enhancer. I'll click on it, and when you do that, it automatically applies a contrast to your image. I like to turn auto contrast off on the right-hand side just by clicking that auto contrast button. And I'm going to move my sliders back to 0, and we're going to start from scratch. So you'll see I've got basic options here. I've got brightness and contrast. If I want to lighten up my image, I can move that over to the right. I can add a little bit of basic contrast to my photo. Take that contrast slider and move it over to the right. I have a way to increase black point. So your black slider here, this can be very helpful for an image where you want to increase that black point. So if I move that over to the right, it's not going to brighten up the highlights for me. It's only going to darken those shadows. And this can help intensify an image that you don't want to overblow some shadows, but you do want to increase. You don't want to overblow the highlights, but you do want to increase the blacks. You want to use this black slider here. You have a shadow saver slider, so you can save shadows and reveal the detail underneath. Same with highlights. And then you've got your local contrast and your clarity sliders. So as I was saying in Lightroom earlier, you can do your basic changes inside Lightroom if you want to, but you can also do most of them here inside of the photo suite. So it's really a one-stop shop for editing, which is really, really great. So if I want to add a little bit of clarity to my image, I could go in and I can do that and just crisp up some of those edges, particularly around the edge of the hair. Now, let's click on the Add button, and I'll show you a couple more of these effect options here. We'll open up the drop-down menu, and I will show you just kind of a random one. I'm not going to end up using it on my image, but I just want to show you that you have this option. You have you have something called a photo filter. And this is a good way to add a color effect to your image. So let's open up that photo filter here. And once again, you've got kind of this baseline, these baseline changes here. The first is the preset drop-down menu. And this allows you to choose a preset that's already pre-packaged in here. So we have a cyan, a red, we've got warming filters, orange, red. We have something called tobacco, which is kind of like an orangey, yellowy, greeny effect. It's kind of a weird sepia tone almost. You've got a yellow filter. So you have all of these different filters. You also have graduated filters, which means that the top is one color and the bottom is one color, which works great for landscapes. So let's go ahead and let's add that tobacco filter there. Your filter type is a solid filter. You can also do something called a bicolor and a graduated filter. It just depends on what you want to do. I'll stick with solid. Here's your color swatch. You can actually change your color swatch specific to anything. So if I click on this, it'll open up my select color dialog box, and I could choose a special color just for this image. So I'm going to swap over to my little color circle here, my color wheel. And I want to add let's say I want to add a bright magenta or a purple. I can go in and I can choose that color depending on my image. I'll click OK. And now I've got my cool lavender-ish filter that I'm going to apply to my image. You can change things like strength if I want it to be really, really strong. I can also change the baseline saturation of my image. So if I want to desaturate my image and add a lavender filter, or if I want my base saturation to be really intense and then I want to add my lavender filter, you have tons of different options here. Tons of different options. So all of these effect options here can be very, very useful. Color enhancer is another great one to use. It separates your image down into color channels, so you can actually edit each one of them separately. So that can also be extremely useful. Now, let's go ahead and really quickly, another thing I want to show you guys is I've got my after image here, and this is the golden hour enhancer. We've got the antique indigo, flat indigo layer that we changed in the blending options, and then we added a tone enhancer on top to brighten up the image a little bit. Now I want to be able to see the before and after On the bottom left-hand side of your screen, there's a little after drop-down menu here. Now you also have a preview box, which I can turn on and off. So here's my original image, and here's my after. So you can see those very, very quickly back and forth just by clicking that preview button. You can also go in and open up this after drop-down menu and see your before or your after here. And then last, you have a set the preview area compare mode. When I click this on, now I can see my before and my after side by side. If you keep on clicking it, you've got a whole bunch of other options. So split image, you've got top and bottom if you're looking at horizontal images, split horizontal, and then back to your original image. So that can be a good way to see your before and after. Now, the last thing I want to show you with this image is I want to show you how to do masking. So I'm actually going to start from scratch, and I'm going to use an effect that is pretty obvious so that you guys can really see how the masking works. So let's go in and let's just add that. Let's add that golden hour enhancer layer again. So we'll click on that to apply it. And you have two different masking tools here that you can use. The first one is called a masking bug, which I'll show you how to use real quick. It allows you to create a masking bug, a mask that is either a rectangular or a round bug. So let's say I'll just click once in my image and it added a rectangular bug. I can resize it if I want to just by clicking and dragging these little arms. I'm actually going to change my shape over to round by going up to the tool options bar and selecting round from my shape drop down menu. And you can create kind of a vignette effect depending on the image that you're editing. So if I wanted this image to have kind of a cool vignette to it, I can go in and do that. You can change things like the feathering. If I want to reduce the feather so it's completely, there's no feathering, or if I want it to be nice and soft and feathered, I can go in and raise that up to 80 or 70%. And now I have a very soft blur in between that warm tone and that cool tone. You can also edit things like mask opacity. So if the mask is a little too intense, you want to bring back some of that golden color, you can do that there as well. So that's how you use the masking bug. There's also a masking brush tool. So let's actually reset our mask. The reset button is in the top right-hand corner here. You also have an invert button. If I click the invert button, it will automatically change your mask to completely black, and you can individually paint in the spots you want to add an effect to. So always know that you have that option. That's a cool little tip for using the program. If there's only a little piece of this image that I want to add a warming filter to, like let's say I just want to warm up her eyes a little bit, I can go in and I can edit just a little tiny bit of the image. Instead of having to erase a whole photo and erase all of those warm tones, I can go in and I can just edit a little tiny bit. So I can paint in my effect and we'll just paint it over her eyes really quickly. Now, let me invert my mask and we're going to go back to our original image here. And I want to show you how to use the perfect brush. So I have this really nice effect going on. However, I don't necessarily like it on, let's say I don't like it on her skin. I can go in and I can paint it out on her skin just by clicking and dragging the brush. However, when I get to some of these edges, I don't want to remove the warm tone from the background or her dress. I like that warmer bluish color. So I'm going to use something called the perfect brush. And this is our edge detection brush. And it comes inside a whole bunch of the different programs, not just Perfect Effects. So always know that you have access to it. If you have the whole suite, not just Perfect Effects, you can use it in lots of different programs. And what it does is it responds to the color information and some of the tone information underneath the crosshair of the brush. So you'll see there's a little minus sign, which means I'm painting out this effect on my image. And wherever that minus sign is, it's pulling that information, that color and tone information from underneath the brush. A quick little tip about using your brush. The left and right bracket keys are what you use to resize it quickly. So I'm using the left bracket key to make it smaller and the right bracket key to make it bigger. You also have, if you hold the shift key and then you click the left and right bracket keys. That edits the feathering amount around the edge of your brush. So if you want a high feather, you move it to the right, and if you want a very low feathering amount, you move it to the left. And you'll see my feathering number is changing up in the tool options bar up there. Now let's go ahead and start painting out. Let's click and drag. Now I'm dragging it over a very large part of her dress, and it's not removing that warm tone until I drag over the dress, and that's when it starts removing it. So as long as I keep my brush over her skin tone, it's only going to select that color. Now, a very important note about this Perfect brush is sometimes you're going to have to click a few times to kind of resample the colors. So the colors are changing a lot when I move my brush down towards the bottom of her arm. It gets a little bit shadowier, that's not a word. It gets a little bit more shadowy, a little darker. And so I want to click and re-add to my color sample a couple of times. So always know that sometimes, it's not going to remember all those colors and resample automatically. Sometimes you got to click a few times to make sure that you're resampling those colors. So I'm just clicking and dragging, clicking and dragging. Now, even though this can sometimes take a little bit more time, or it looks like it's taking more time, this is a lot easier than having to zoom in 100% and individually paint out little sections. So I can click, and we're just painting out the skin tone here on her face. So I'm just kind of clicking and dragging, and I'm not worried about it removing it from her hair or her hat. I'm only removing this color from her skin, and it's doing a really, really nice job of doing it. We can get up and in through some of those little hair tendrils there, and so on. So always know that you have access to this Perfect brush. This can be very, very helpful depending on the type of image that you're working on. If I want to go in and I want to remove some sort of tone or effect from just part of my photo, I can go in and do that. Now let's cancel this really, really quickly. I want to save the last 10 minutes for questions. We've got a couple that are popping up. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I'm going to answer those in the last 10 minutes. And I want to show you guys a really, really quick landscape and something that's very important inside Perfect Effects and using the suite. So I have this image here. It has a completely boring background, completely boring sky. And I like the foreground. I like that kind of, it's got the cute little bicycle in the front. I want to add some sort of kind of grungy effect to this. However, the sky stinks. There is no sky whatsoever. So I want to go in and I want to replace the sky, and then I want to edit my image. Now, instead of going straight into Perfect Effects, I want to go into Perfect Layers first because I need to remove my background and add a new one. So from the File menu, I'll go down to Plugin Extras and then choose Perfect Layers. And it'll pop me into the program. Now I need to add my new background. And you can add a background of your own. I like to use the backgrounds in the Extras category just because they're nice, they're prepackaged. I don't have to worry about shooting a whole bunch of skies when I'm driving, which probably isn't a good idea anyways because I should be looking at the road. So if you go to the Extras category and you go to the background section, you'll see there's a whole area just for skies. And you can use any sky that you want. If I want kind of a bluer sky, I could try out this one here. If I want kind of a cool cloudy sky, I could try a couple here. So try any of these options that you want. Just depends on the kind of sky that you're looking for. So I'm actually going to let's use this one right here. I'm going to double click on it and add it as a brand new layer. And bam, I've got my new sky. I'll click and drag this layer inside my layers stack underneath my photo layer. And now I'm just going to go to my Oregon road trip image here. Now I can go into Perfect Mask to remove this background, but you also have access to that same Perfect brush inside of Perfect Layers, and this can be very, very helpful. So I have my masking brush selected, and I want to mask out this background here. I'm going to turn my Perfect brush on, and I'm going to click and drag, and you'll see it's revealing the sky underneath. If you have a big section like I do here, turn the Perfect brush off and just do a nice big sweep. This can be really helpful. Sometimes people go overboard with that Perfect brush. I don't need it for the top part of my image. I just need it for the bottom part of my image. So I can just click and drag very quickly along the top. And then when I'll turn my Perfect brush on is when I need to get in a little bit closer and get a little bit more specific about the edge that I'm removing. So we're just clicking and dragging. Oops, clicked and dragged into the wrong part. You don't want to click and drag in your background. That's bad. Click and drag, click and drag. Now, if there's a section that you accidentally screw up on, if you turn the X key, click the X key on your keyboard, it reverses your brush, and now I can add my background back in, which I think is really cool. So if I zoom in a little bit, I can go in and we'll add back in that little layer of red roof. We'll just click and drag. Sometimes this will take a few times to get through because I want to remove just that tree there. If I had an entire hour, I would go in and do this very quickly. However, we don't because we're almost at 11:50, so I got to go quickly. It actually doesn't look that bad for doing it in probably about 40 seconds. Now, inside Perfect Layers, really quickly, these two images are on separate layers. So I have my foreground layer with my bike, and then I have my background layer. Now, the background layer here, once I select it, I can resize it really quickly to make it fit by using something called the transform tool. And this allows you to transform the size of your layer and change it a little bit. So if I want to make it a little bit smaller, I'll just click and drag. And we're clicking and dragging. I can also rotate it if I want to. So we'll click and we're just dragging it into place. I can rotate it if I want it to be lined up a little bit more with the line of the background. And once I'm done and I click apply, it'll save those changes for me. Now, what's really, really cool about this is I can edit each one of these layers inside of Perfect Effects separately. And this is what I wanted to get to, is this bottom part of the image, I need to make some edits to. It doesn't match my sky. I don't like the way that it looks. It needs kind of a pump of clarity there. So when I choose it inside Perfect Layers and I go up to Perfect Effects, it'll show the whole image inside Perfect Effects. So it looks like I'm editing the whole photo. However, when I add an effect to it, so let's add a kind of a grungy effect to it real quick so you guys can really see what happens. Let's add Grunge Goddess. It only affected the bottom part of my image and left my sky alone. This is a great way to do very unique editing to your images by separating it down into sections. So if you're a big masker and you really like to mask out backgrounds, mask out parts of your image, you like to combine multiple images together, you can always edit them separately. And this is so, so, so useful because the bottom part of this image doesn't match the top part of my image. So I can go in and I can edit it if I want to. So if I wanted to add a little bit of clarity down to the bottom, it'll open up my tone enhancer layer here, and I can go in and edit things like brightness, brighten up the bottom part, add a little bit of contrast to intensify it. I'll intensify my black point there to really increase that look. I can add a little bit of local contrast because I'm not editing a portrait, so that kind of grungy, almost HDR styling to it can actually be really cool. And I can also go in and maybe, let's say I want to cool the bottom down a little bit. I can add a cooling filter here as well. So I'll click on cool and we'll go in and I will select the cooler filter and I'm just going to lower the amount down until I'm happy. So we're just going to cool it down a little bit. I want a very flat look and now we're good. Now when I click apply, it's going to put me back into Perfect Layers, and this is really great because you'll see now I have my original image here, my original road trip image with my crappy sky, and then this one is my road trip image with the same mask, so the same edit that I took out of my original photo, that background I removed, with my new Perfect Effects on top of it. So I can see my before and after of that bottom part. You can also do the exact same thing with the sky. So if I want to take this into, let's say, focal point, and I want to edit out and I want to add a little soft blur to my background, I can do it just to the background. And then I can place it into Perfect Effects and add maybe a warming filter to it or a cooling filter to it or so on. So when you're editing landscapes, and I know a lot of people do, you have the option of bringing it into Perfect Layers and separating your image out into sections, so background and foreground, and then going in and editing each one of those separately. So you can do it inside Perfect Effects using your masking brush, or you can do it in Perfect Layers and separate your image down into different layers.